Hi everyone, how's it going? Well, continuing on with my series on videos on science fiction films, now into the 1980s, and today I'm going to talk about Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, which was released in June of 1982. Now, this was an important movie for the Star Trek franchise. It really revitalized Star Trek, so this was a huge moment that allowed the franchise to continue, and it's still going today. Of course, in 1979, the Star Trek The Motion Picture was released, which did well. It did okay. It was, kind of got a tepid response. I know some people loved it, but there were criticisms that there was too much emphasis on special effects. The story was a bit dry, cerebral, so there was a sense of if they were going to do another film, there needed to be a little bit of a course correction. And one of the things that was done was Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was phased out of the franchise somewhat. He played a big role in the creative process of the first film, but would really not have much of a place for the second film. And another TV producer, Harve Bennett, was brought in to develop a new story for a second Star Trek film. And famously, Harve Bennett screened all of the episodes of the original Star Trek at the studio, and there was one episode that really jumped out at him, and it was the Space Seed episode, which was the one where Kirk and the Enterprise stumbled upon a ship that had genetically enhanced humans from Earth. The so-called eugenics wars, where you had Khan and who led a war against humanity and was eventually exiled from Earth, and hundreds of years later, the crew of the Enterprise stumble upon Khan, and of course Khan tries to take over the ship right away, leading to a conflict between him and Kirk. And the episode ends with Khan being exiled to another planet. If I remember right, that episode even ends with, "I wonder what will happen 20 years from now." So we almost get like the calling for a sequel at the end of the Star Trek episode. So Harve Bennett developed a story around it, and other script writers were brought in. I mean, there was a lot went on in between the motion picture and Wrath of Khan as far as developing the story, and this one went through different iterations. Like, one involved Khan leading armies on a planet, and Captain Kirk and his son David leading the fight against Khan. So there were many different ideas being kicked around, and Nicholas Meyer was finally brought in, who had directed Time After Time, which I've talked about, to write his own script, synthesize all the ideas from the previous scripts, and add some things of his own. So Nicholas Meyer, I believe, said that his job was to take the best stuff from these scripts and then add some of his own, and of course take out the stuff that he didn't think worked. So Meyer did a few crucial things. I mean, he brought a more character-driven story, a more action story. He brought a real nautical sensibility to it, where he wanted this to have like a Horatio Hornblower feel to it. He wanted the look of the Enterprise and the music, the whole thing of the film to have this real nautical theme of maritime warfare in space. So that was one aspect to it, and also bringing in a lot of literary influences into the film, whether taking from Shakespeare. The original title was The Undiscovered Country, the quotation from Hamlet, but also there's direct passages from Herman Melville's Moby Dick. There's A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens is referenced throughout the film, and there's just a lot of it just brings so much flavor to it. It makes Star Trek feel like literature, bringing in all these references to the story, which is very much Nicholas Meyer. So they had the script, and also there was, in the making of every Star Trek movie, there would be a lot of acrimony with the cast, with William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy and the others in the cast who were frustrated with would they get enough screen time. Shatner, knowing Shatner, typically wanted the stories to focus on Kirk, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And Leonard Nimoy as well was maybe a bit tired of the character at this point, and the idea was put across of maybe killing off Spock, which is what they decided to do. And there was a whole thing, like there were rumors among the fans, and but it did generate a lot of buzz for this movie. Like, wow, were they going to kill off this beloved character from Star Trek? And that, I think ultimately that really worked well for the movie too, as far as getting people interested. Even non-Star Trek fans, would probably want to be in on this. And I think in some ways everyone knew what Star Trek was. I mean, it was still playing on TV all the time, so there was a real momentum happening, and all they really needed was just a really good story, a really good script, and that's really what they got with Wrath of Khan. I mean, the themes of the story dealing with mortality and aging and all legacy, all these things really, everything fell into place. And the opening scene in the movie is great, and it sets up the theme with the Kobayashi Maru test, where every Starfleet cadet must undergo this test where they face a no-win situation. And the test is not about, it's about how the cadet responds to a no-win situation. What does it reveal about their character? And I think that's such a great concept for any movie. And I actually looked it up. Nicholas Meyer, I believe, took that idea from an earlier script, and there's a backstory to that which I won't get into, the whole concept of the Kobayashi Maru. But it's a great concept though, and I think that carries throughout the entire movie. The idea of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and how how this applies to the character arcs in the movie is really, really well done. And I think the idea too is, like, we're all going to have to face it someday, like a no-win situation, thinking about mortality and things like that, and how do we handle it. I mean, it's even a great quote by Kirk in the film, how we deal with death is at least as important as how we deal with life, and the dialogue is just so good in this movie. There's just so many. It just has a real polish to the dialogue, and it's Shakespearean, and it's many things, and there's just so many quotable lines, to just a real stateliness to the dialogue that it really goes through the entire picture with it. So you have the dialogue, you have that great setup to the film, and famously, Spock is killed off, like in the first few minutes of the film, as a great fake out for the audience, as Lieutenant Savick, played by Kirstie Alley, who is a up and coming officer in Starfleet in the film. And so that was a great way to start the film. It did set up the mortality theme, and I think, of course, not to get too much into summarizing the story, but of course we Chekhov, we follow Chekhov, who's with a ship, the Reliant, who comes upon, they accidentally come across where Khan has been exiled, and we learn that the planet he was left on quickly became uninhabitable, and most of his colony has died, although there's a few survivors still there. And once Khan realizes he could take over a starship, and he could get his revenge on Kirk and the Federation. So it's a great setup. Ricardo Montalban as the antagonist in the film it's one of the great performances, I think, of any Star Trek movie. I've been chasing it. I mean, just how menacing and charming he is. He's somewhat sympathetic in some ways, but he does have a real viciousness to him. Meyer brought in the Captain Ahab parallel with Khan as well, which was a really really cool thing to bring to the character. And that creepy scene where he's introduced, where he has those worms, and Chekhov and the other officer, get Paul Winfield. They have these ears go into their brains. I know that as a kid that used to creep me out. It's still kind of unsettling, that scene, but that's really good. Yeah, and the story goes. I mean, we're introduced to David, played by Merrick Buttrick, who was Kirk's, I guess, estranged son that he never knew about, and so he has a role in the story, and and of course the Enterprise is called to see what's going on with the Reliant and the ship, and of course this leads to the confrontation with Khan, where Kirk and Khan have their confrontation over the starships, and that's one of the other unique things about this movie that's always pointed out, is that Kirk and Khan never actually share a scene together. They're never actually physically in the same space, and I don't know if I've never heard a definite answer whether that was planned that way or that's just how it worked out, but it makes the movie unique. I'm curious if anyone has opinions on that, or do you wish there had been a scene where Kirk and Khan have a physical confrontation? I guess it would have been a fight. I mean, clearly, if they would have met, there would have been a fight. And of course, Khan is super strong, so maybe Khan would have won the fight, but it's hard to say. But it's really Captain Kirk's story. I've seen this movie a number of times, and I was asking, like, who is this story about? Well, clearly it's about Khan, the antagonist, but it's really about Kirk, dealing with his mortality, and what is his role, at this point in his life, where yeah, he is the captain of the Enterprise yet, but for how long? He sees the younger people coming in, who are young, and they have all that youthful energy to them, and he realizes that time is starting to pass him by a little bit, and the film really handles that well. There's a real theme of rebirth in the film too, and Kirk kind of has his own rebirth in the movie, where ironically it is through confronting his old nemesis Khan, where Kirk does seem to find purpose, and it's through trying to stop this threat, and to save the Federation once again. So it's a great character arc for Kirk, where he needs, I guess that's what makes the character compelling, where he needs the challenge. He always needs the challenge, and that's really what drives a character like Kirk. And of course with Spock in the film, who, that's one thing I was thinking. The film is not necessarily Spock's story, even though he plays a major role. Of course, he ends up sacrificing himself to save the crew of the Enterprise, and in one of the most legendary scenes ever, where Spock is dying, and Kirk, they're separated by the wall or whatever, and they have their final. They have to say their goodbyes to each other. It's just deeply moving scene. And I mean, Spock doesn't have a clear arc as Kirk in this film. But he that whole idea of sacrificing yourself for the good of others, and where Spock has his own Kobayashi Maru test, and he his character is revealed, of course, in the test, and Kirk kind of has his own Kobayashi Maru test in the middle of the film, where what does Kirk do in that situation, and where he finds a way to get around it. That's like what Kirk's character is. He always finds a way to somehow beat the odds of, and that's there too. So that's part of the film. I know some of the other cast in the film, and that's one thing. This is really a Kirk-driven story. It's about Kirk and Khan and Spock to somewhat extent, but the other members of the crew don't have a lot to do. I guess Chekhov has some scenes in the beginning with Khan, but Sulu is still kind of stuck, helming the ship, and Uhura is has a few lines, and I know McCoy and Kirk have a good scene where they talk about McCoy is trying to offer Kirk some encouragement about being down about his birthday and everything. So there's that. Scotty gets some action to do. His nephew, of course, gets killed, and I know that's in the more extended version in Khan's initial attack. So there is that though. But I mentioned this with the motion picture, where the Star Trek movies that work best, that are the ones that are, they're character driven. They have the spirit of the TV show, and you kind of have that B movie pulpy flavor to it. It's not, the motion picture tried to be really big and epic, like a 2001 type of science fiction movie, whereas Wrath of Khan, it's just a very well contained, straightforward story with just strong themes, character driven throughout, and that really seemed to be the model of how to do a Star Trek movie, and I think for other franchises too, a role model of how to do a sequel, and how to keep the story vital and everything. So yeah, and I think that's really part of the legacy of this film, is what you can do with a sequel. We get sequels all the time now, but I think Wrath of Khan will always be considered one of the greatest sequels of all time. And you could argue too, without Wrath of Khan, we don't get, of course, the future Star Trek movies. There would be 3, 4, 5, and 6 with the original cast, and then you get the Next Generation in the mid '80s, and more movies, and then the more spin-offs of Star Trek. So yeah, Wrath of Khan really is important to it, and I should mention the music by James Horner is fantastic. The Goldsmith score was great for the first film, but Horner really goes with that nautical theme, and we get these big bombastic, score music about battles and dramatic. It's very good. Just almost equals the first film in terms of how good the score is here, and the special effects I think are important to this movie as well, where ILM did the special effects, and they're good, but they're not showy. Where I think there was a sense the first film, there would be those long scenes of watching the ships kind of float and everything, kind of a show off type special effects, but I think this is also a great model of how to use special effects, where they're not there just for the purpose of being a special effect. The special effects drive the story forward, whether it's the space battles or some of the CGI computer graphics used with the Genesis program. The special effects are used to further the story, and it just works. It just really works well. It really falls together with the special effects. So yeah. So I'm trying to think of my favorite scene in Star Trek 2. I mean, there's so many good ones. Of course, the scene with Kirk and Spock, their farewell, is a deeply moving scene. There's like I said, the dialogue is so good throughout the movie, and I think I am trying to think of another scene that I really like, that's really good. There's and there's a lot of just talking. There is there are dialogue scenes, but they move. The film just moves much quicker, and we don't dwell on it as much. I talked about the opening, which is really good, and the so it's, the whole movie's good, and it's a classic, no doubt about it. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.